Welcome to an interview with Clear Mountain. Today we're joined by Ajahn Brahmali. Ajahn, thank you so much for coming and joining us today. So a brief introduction. Ajahn Brahmali was born in Norway in 1964. He first became interested in Buddhism and meditation in his early 20s after a visit to Japan. After having completed degrees in engineering and finance, he began his monastic training in England at Amravati and Chithurst Buddhist monasteries. After hearing teachings from Ajahn Brahm, he decided to travel to Australia to train at Bodhinyana Monastery. Ajahn Brahmali has lived at Bodhinyana Monastery since 1994 and was ordained as a bhikkhu with Ajahn Brahm as his preceptor in 1996. Ajahn Brahmali's knowledge of the Pali language and of the suttas is excellent. A regular contributor to Discourse Sutta Central, he has also published 2 essays on dependent origination and a book called The Authenticity of the Early Buddhist Texts with Bhante Sujato. And just to say, of all the teachers I listen to online, often Ajahn Brahmali really is one of the ones I constantly tune into. His love of the suttas. I think you classified yourself as a sutta junkie, Ajahn, and just the warmth and care and precision of your ethos regarding the Buddha's words has been a blessing. So it's so wonderful to have you on again.
Great for having me. It's great pleasure to be here.
We've also discovered we have a bit of a lag, so people can be patient with us. But Ajahn, the first question, I wanted to start with asking you if you had a kind of a favorite hidden gem of a sutta or kind of a sutta that's just resonated with you over the years that kind of pops into mind when I ask that question. One of the teachings of the Buddha that has just kind of stayed with you over these past decades.
It's thank you. First of all, thank you for having me. And it's great pleasure to be here. And I say, I've always found the sutta so inspiring because as far as we know, this is the word of the Buddha. And of course, the Buddha is the founder of our tradition. So I think listening to the Buddha kind of makes incredibly good sense because everything else depends on the word of the Buddha. Everything else only have meaning kind of in light of the word of the Buddha. And so every time I open the sutta, I think this is my favorite sutta every time I can open it, because whatever is fresh in mind is beautiful. And so whatever is fresh in mind is what kind of obvious thing that you focus on. But I think over the kind of structure in the suttas that I have relied the most on is, which you find in a large number of places, but the particular verse of the Mista is the Chula Hatipatopama Sutta, which is the shortest sutta on the elephant's kind number 27. And that it happens also to be the sutta spoken by Mahinda, Ajah's son, when he and his sister Sangamita traveled to kind of spread Buddhism to Sri Lanka. That was the sutta he spoke to the royal kind of entourage. And it is said to be the sutta that sort of made Sri Lanka into a Buddhist country. And I can see why. It's a very, very beautiful and powerful sutta. So I think that kind of is on my very top list. It's not a very obscure sutta at all, but it is actually very, very beautiful. Another example, you asked me about one sutta. Of course, I'm going to give you many straight away. Another example, which is more obscure, is recently we did a retreat on the Parinavagga. The Parinavagga is the last Shapipata, which I'm sure you know that. And it is about these 16 questions about the meaning of life and how to end suffering. And it's very, very beautiful suttas in many ways. And it kind of shows in a sense, the clash is the wrong word, the kind of different tradition and how they kind of deal with each other, so to speak. Yeah. And the first verse, the student there, his name is Ajahn. Those verses of Ajahn are also very beautiful and profound and kind of encapsulate the entire Parinavagga in one person's questions to the Buddha, where the Buddha replies to the questions. So that is very and very interesting from a historical perspective at the same time. So I think I'll stop there, otherwise I'm going to have a sutta, so I better stop.
Thank you for those two. And I love how in the Parayana I believe they ask initially their questions without even speaking. But Ajahn, would you say a little more about the gradual training in the Hathipadopama Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 27? What, for those who are listening who haven't really encountered the gradual training, why is that a profound teaching, and kind of the outline in that sutta that makes it especially potent for you?
Yeah, well, the nice thing about it gives an expanded teaching on the path all the way from the very beginning all the way to the, and everyone is going to file from that path somewhere, along that line somewhere from the beginning. And so you can situate yourself on the spectrum from the start to the end, and you can kind of see what you'll be doing in your. So that's one reason. It kind of gives a very clear idea what the path really is about. And when you read carefully, what you realize it actually is an expansion of the Noble Eightfold Path. You can put it next to the Noble Path, and it matches the Noble Eightfold Path almost perfectly. So basically, it is in an expanded kind of version. That makes it very. One of the things that I love about the gradual training is that the gradual training, you think, surely it must refer to what I am doing as a person. Yeah, I am going to train. I'm going to start getting this virtue. Then I will practice meditation. And it's all about I will do this, I will do that. This I kind of gets involved in this all the time. But then training, and it starts with the idea of a Buddha arising in the world. That's the big training. And the Buddha arising in the world it's a completely, I would say it's almost like a random event. Occasionally, Buddhas in the world. And so that shows you that the gradual training at the end of it has got nothing to do with you. You are kind of subject to the training. It's like the Dhamma works. And then as the Dhamma works on you, it kind of gets formed and shaped. And it gets shaped into Dhamma. Spat out at the other end, and you are a free mentor or an arahant at the other end. It shows you that actually what we need to do is get the I as a problem. It's not really you doing the path. It's the Buddha arising in the world, the Dhamma being present, the Dhamma conditioning you, the Dhamma brainwashing you, right? You get brainwashed in a beautiful way, and then at the end of the day, you kind of come out the other end. And so that is kind of one of those things that is very interesting, because it shows you this idea of anatta, of an atman, of non-self, becomes very kind of prominent when you understand the significance of the Buddha arising in the world at the very beginning of the path. But one of the things I also love about this particular sutta is this particular simile of the elephant's footprint. And you kind of you follow an elephant, and you don't actually know it's an elephant yet, but you see a footprint, some branches being broken off on the trees or whatever. So you kind of are following along, and you realize the more signs you see, as this is very, very likely to be a massively large element of the footprint and all this. And then eventually you see that elephant, sitting at the foot of a tree or whatever. It parallels this with the gradual training. Jhanas are the footprint of the Buddha, right? These are when you see a jhana, basically you are in the presence of some giant animal. A bit kind of blasphemous if we had blasphemy. You're in the presence of some really powerful and remarkable being, or whatever kind. And that is one thing is that tells you of the incredible importance of samadhi on the Buddhist path. This is the footprint of the Buddha. You know that you are in the presence of the Buddha. Even when you come to the jhanas, you're getting very, very close. These are not very far away from the awakening stages. You're kind of getting there. And then you kind of carry on, and eventually you see the elephant, that of course means you become a stream mentor or an arahant in the final analysis. So these are some of the things that I really love about that sutta. But yeah.
Thank you, Ajahn. Yeah, so just to give everyone a bit more context for those who don't yet know you or aren't so familiar with your teachings, this is the second time that we interviewed you. We interviewed you about 4 years ago with a general theme of early Buddhist texts, which is a field of research and study and translation, which you're certainly one of the giants in. But this time we were thinking about maybe focusing on the theme of translation in general, and not just translation from ancient languages, classical Chinese or Pali or Sanskrit to English, although we will ask questions about that, but also about translating like what might seem like ancient concepts into, speaking to modern audiences from, suttas that are in this, for lack of a better word, religious context to a more secular audience, if and when you do that. Teaching in different countries. Right before we went live, you were talking about teaching in Sri Lanka, and of course, right now, although you're from Norway, you live in Australia. So all these different cultural contexts, and all of that involves some degree of translation. But to start with, I thought maybe just to get more of your background in a number of I think the first place I came across your name was in the answer key to Warder's Intro to Pali, which I think you put together in 2004. But there you say that your one and only Pali teacher was Ajahn Brahm. And I'm curious if you could just talk about your experience of learning Pali with Ajahn Brahm. Was that a daily thing? Was it one-on-one? Was it fun? Was he cracking jokes all the time? And what were his principles for translation that you took on or didn't take on?
Yeah, so that came to Bodhidharma Monastery, the 6th of August 1994, when I arrived here. And this was just the beginning of and Ajahn Brahm was actually teaching Pali during the rains retreat. And normally you think rains retreat is all about meditation, but he was actually teaching Pali. I think the first and the last time Ajahn Brahm, maybe not the last time he actually taught Pali. And that was good. Ajahn Brahm has a very confident individual when he teaches, feeling that this is what you're getting now is the absolute truth, and there's no doubts about it. He has a great confidence about him, especially in those days. These days, there's a feeling of someone who really, who I think he really, really well. So he had some good reasons for that, and that was good. And I knew that as a Buddhist, to understand the foundation of what Buddhism really is about. And so learning Pali was kind of obvious to me. There was no kind of two ways about it. I was definitely going to learn Pali. And so I was very fortunate. Ajahn Brahm himself, completely autodidact. He didn't learn from anyone else. It's just kind of his own reading A.K. Warder and learning it. But he has a very good mind. And so he did that really, really well. What it was like is basically, learn so much who you learn it from, I think. It's kind of grammar is grammar. But he did it in a way that was not too rigid. Those days it didn't tell quite as many jokes as days. It kind of changed a lot. But he always has a very good feeling about him. Ajahn has always been a very kind kind of person in that of met classes. But one of the important things that I always enjoyed with Ajahn Brahm was his kind of the broader context in which it's everything in. And I remember one of the, part of the things I enjoyed when Ajahn Brahm into Australia was that in those days he also did sutta classes from the suttas. And he had this amazing ability, I recall, to kind of focus on one sutta and then bring context from other suttas, bring it all together, and then illuminate things across vast range of sutras and texts or whatever, to me, it became like the model for how to actually read the sutras, how to understand them, understand their own context primarily, because that gives you the best way of understanding what is going on. And one of the things that came out of that, or kind of a subsidiary or an auxiliary way of understanding it, was a piece of advice that he gave me a long time ago, which he in turn got from Veronica in Sri Lanka, when he was in Sri Lanka back in the early 90s. And he said that you should never take an obscure teaching. Yeah, we know enough about obscure teachings. There are some very rare words there. You should never take an obscure teaching and read the rest of the sutras in light of that obscure teaching. You should take the majority of sutras, the bigger kind of paradigms, and read all the obscure passages in light of larger and broader paradigms. And I think that is such a thing that people often forget, I myself. And the reason is because those obscure passages, because they are obscure, they're kind of interested. They're things that we like to discuss and we like to kind of, yeah. So that thing is a very important piece right there. So yeah, anyway.
Thank you, Ajahn. I really love talking about this. And I actually want to get your thoughts. I've heard a saying that all English literature exists in the shadow of Shakespeare. And I felt like all Pali translation in our age exists in the shadow of Bhikkhu Bodhi. And, it's interesting to see, he came forward with these very prominent wisdom editions. And then you kind of see other translators just trying sometimes to not say what Bhikkhu Bodhi said already. And yet there also are really relevant other flavors, like Ajahn Thanissaro has a very, very direct, very meticulous, precise languaging. Bhante Sujato, I think of him a bit as the trickster, a rebel in the mix a little bit. He's also able to invoke these deep Vedic resonances because he's done the research there. Whereas Bhikkhu Bodhi also invokes commentary and a bit more, I'd say that's part of his tradition a little bit. So would you sort of lay out the giants of the translation landscape for us in terms of how you understand and how you interact with them? Like, do you read all three usually and then translate it yourself? Or I'm just curious about you speaking to the greats.
I have a for Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi, and I think in terms of language abilities to articulate things in English, it's just beautiful language. I mean, he'd be able to find anyone with that kind of English style. Just extraordinary essays and everything he writes are so well written and so has such integrity and just overall very, very, very good. But I think one of the important things to remember is that because we are translations is not an exact art, and obviously there are many different ways of doing exactly the same thing. And unfortunately, there is no one-on-one correspondence of Pali ideas or Pali words or Pali paragraphs. We have to make choices. And those choices means that you're going to be the translation in a certain way. So everyone is going to have their slant. Everyone is going to have their bias. Unfortunately, Bhikkhu Bodhi, it's just the way it has to be. So by reading different translators, you actually gain the Dhamma that is behind it. And so you see things. And so one of the things you didn't mention about me, which I think is really important, you should have it in the beginning, Vinaya Pitaka, right? And so I have a lot of experience myself, translations. So I'm just messing around, don't worry about it. But obviously, one of the things I did was I refused to look at prior translations while I was doing my translation. I didn't look at some of the translation by Ajahn Thanissaro or whatever, because I knew that once I do that, I'm going to be biased. I'm going to be led kind of by their ideas rather than reading the Pali. And so what I did instead was I decided, first of all, the Pali as I saw it, seeing, then going to I.B. Hall, going to what the little Nishno has translated, and comparing it with them, and then cutting my own translation if I got something wrong, which often you get things here. That to me then creates translations that are, and they are more valuable because they give a more neutral standpoint on which kind of to look at. And so that is what I also do when I translate suttas. I don't translate the suttas a lot, but whenever I do a sutta retreat, which I do all the time, then I try to look at it to kind of see what is going on here without kind of other people. Then later on, I come back to Bhikkhu Bodhi and Sujatā's translations and see what they have to say. I think the reality is that at many different translators, if you don't probably look at different translators, try an overview of what is going on in translations, and I think your understanding of the underlying Pali becomes far better as a consequence of that. If you can investigate the Pali words, because sometimes it can be helpful to investigate Pali word. Words like Dhamma and Sankhara are particularly prone to kind of weirdness. I remember I wasn't upset is the wrong word. I was very I wanted to challenge Bhikkhu Bodhi on the translations of Sankhara as volitional formations. Can understand the idea of volitional formations. I've been a monk for 20 years, and so I said it's something that we can relate to, right? And so I wrote this to him, and he did act on that, which I thought was very interesting. So so we need kind of that broad outlook, understanding some underlying idea of what some of those are. Yes, was studying individual words, and in this approach to Dhamma, and you can use the translation. Bhikkhu Bodhi, to my mind, is foremost among them. But the Sujatā's translation has the as you say, he takes in more the Vedic text prior to that, and he often uses quite a simple language. Is also very nice. Sometimes Bodhi is kind of a bit highfalutin in dictionaries to understand what he's saying, but he's great. Yeah, and what Bhante Sujatāta does, I don't know if you've seen that, but he has kind of brought Australianism by stealth into the translation. So you have to really understand what is going on here. There's a town in India called Nagaraka, and the Nagara means like the town city. Yeah, Nagara means town itself, and so the town is called Nagara. So it means like the town or whatever. And so there is a town in Australia called Townsville. Like Ville is town, right? So town. And so it translates Nagara, which if you live in a because everyone knows the reference straight away, actually. And another place, he has this, there is a Australian national anthem, there is the land girt by sea, yeah? Because Australia is like an island, so it's girt by sea. And so he has this, somewhere he has this, by sea, that somehow he has played translation. If you live over here in Australia, what it refers to, so it has this kind of places, which is kind of cute. It just kind of, because it shows that whatever you do, there is going to be some degree of bias, and sometimes you are just open about that bias, and you put it in there in a more kind of well, at least if you're Australian, it's fairly obvious. Anyway, I'll stop there. So let's carry on.
We just came across Townville in a recent sutta, actually, and was wondering about that.
One of those late Majjhima 90s or something. But,
how do you translate Sankhara then, Tanajan?
I think this is one of the things that I feel quite strongly about, that translating the same Pali word across the board with the same English translation is bound to one-to-one match, and Pali words. They have a different extent, different encompass of broadening. And so trying to do that one-to-one is a complete thing to do with his initial translation of the Madhya. And it is in places very, very obscure for that reason, very hard to follow that. And so I think what you need to do is you need different contexts in which Sankara is used, and then you have to translate differently in different contexts. So the main context of Sankara in the Sutta is the will or intention, right? Dependent ordination, or in the five khandhas, it usually means the will or volition or something like that. Choice, Sudatta's translate. I said to Bhikkhu Bodhi, what do you think about the Sudatta's choices? I asked him deliberately, and he was not very impressed with that translation.
Bad choice.
That was very funny. Bad choice. That's right. Bad Sankara. So he and I can see would say that. I can also understand why Bhante Sudatta translates with choices. I think both of them have a point. But so in that context, it means the will, applying the will, applying volition, intentions. I mean, all those things. But in the context like Sabbe Sankhara Anicca, all Sankharas are impermanent. Obviously, it doesn't have that meaning. That is a very different as dukkha. Obviously, they're all phenomena, and I think it should be translated as phenomena. So all phenomena are impermanent, and I think that's where you get a better translation. In other places, like in Ayu Sankhara, in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the life Sankhara, I think there it means something more like the life force. And so there we have force. Just like will is a kind of force that drives the mind and drives the body. In the same way, he has a deeper sense of force that involved in the khandhas somehow. So those are my So those are some. So I would say that I would translate Sankhara as a will when it's origination, as a phenomena in Sabbe Sankhara Anicca Sankhara, roughly.
Yeah, so that is principle number 8. You've got a great list of 9 principles that you have come up with in terms of how you translate. And the 8th principle is sometimes using multiple expressions for a single Pali term, depending on context. And we might go into some of those other principles for translation. They're great. I saw that someone had back translated your principles into Thai for Thai people translating going forward. But just to go back, one of the giants, which we referred to obliquely of Pali translation, is I.B. Horner, who is a great aunt of Ajahn Amaro, who was president of the Pali Text Society, met Rise David supposedly at a dinner party when she was a young girl. And he predicted that she would, become a great Pali translator when she was just in her teens. And she certainly did, but she never lived as a monastic. But she was the first one to do the first full translation of the Vinaya, almost full, into English. But your translation was a complete translation. You didn't have any lacuna, parts left out for indecency. She did have like a Victorian moral sense about not wanting to talk about certain very explicit things, which you translated. But I'm curious, most people have not and probably will not read the Vinaya. So for those who don't know, the Vinaya is basically the first 6 books, the Vinaya Pitaka, the first 6 books of 40 of the Pali canon. And they're all of the origin stories and accounts of monks and nuns behaving badly at the time of the Buddha. So whereas the suttas are like the most inspiring part, these are the least inspiring part. And I'm curious if you had any lessons, what are your takeaways from spending years probably translating the Vinaya? Was it depressing day in and day out translating these like bad monk and nun stories, or was it actually very humanizing? You get to see, oh yeah, they were bad, and we're not always the best ourselves. So both, lessons, spiritual lessons, and also maybe any linguistic lessons that you took from that translation.
Yeah. So I think spiritual lessons as you say, I think it's more humanizing, actually. And we often have this idea that at the time of the Buddha, everyone was enlightened, they were great, they could become arahants, but in the present day, everything is terrible and we are kind of evil and sinful and whatever, and so we can't kind of get there. But I think that is a complete misunderstanding. I think the Vinaya sets that view straight. We see that the defilements of human beings are the same over time. Yeah, we are not all that different. One of the great things about reading the Vinaya and the Sutras is to see that, it's easy to feel that there is a big separation between us and ancient India, 2,500 years, different culture. You see people doing psychic powers and all this kind of stuff, which can alienate you from the Sutras. But actually, the more I realize that people are pretty much the same across time, all that different at all, actually. And this is so it humanizes the people at the time of the Buddha. It gives us a feeling that if they, so can we. Absolutely, we can do it. This is one of those. And if you start to think that we can't do it, number one cause for not to do it, right? That kind of is a big obstacle right there. And so shouldn't. I think this is a very bad way. Is one of the, I think, primary, maybe spiritual kind of understandings that come out of that. Also, what comes out of it is the stickiness of the different, very, very key. You see some people like, who broke almost any conceivable precept, go through the Vinaya everywhere, like Udayan and Upananda and Tulananda and all of these people. And so it kind of gives you this, I think if you are wise, it gives you a sense of humility about the difficulty of overcoming that, and how careful you have to be. And so you don't kind of overestimate yourself and think that I easily, even if your meditation is going really well, how quickly it can backtrack and go on. And so we have to be really, really careful about that. Another thing that in the Vinaya, which is more of a spiritual character rather than a linguistic character, is the Buddha. The Buddha comes out in a very beautiful way. Yeah. And you have some of the very famous passages about the Buddha is found in the Vinaya. Both know the passage with the sick monk, where the monk is lying on the ground. He is filthy and absolutely terrible. Dysentery basically means that kind of everything goes through you and you become really, really filthy. And so the Buddha sees this. And when the Buddha sees that, he says to Venerable Ananda, well, here is the Buddha cleaning a monk, absolutely filthy. So they he and Venerable Ananda, and then they kind of put him into robes again, and Ananda by the feet, and they lift him up on the bed. The Buddha, right? This is not, and there's something very humanizing about that. It makes the Buddha into a real being. And I think the more you read, especially the Vinaya, but also the Sutras, you see the Buddha as a human being, not as some god or some kind of amazing person who just does psychic powers or who gives special teachings all the time. No, the Buddha was a human being. He looked after you as a human being, not just your spiritual, also your physical well-being. Another thing that comes to mind, which I find is very kind of sweet episode in the Sutra, the Kosala Sangha. And in the Kosala Sangha is, of course, all the conversations between the Buddha Pasenadi. And in one of the King Pasenadi is kind of huffing and walking to the Buddha. And he's obviously overweight and the other things. And so the Buddha kind of says to him, well, what's going on? I says, oh, I'm eating. Okay, I'm going to help you I'm going to help you to have a better diet. Kind of reduce your weight, the weight loss program. Right? That's kind of what it is about. And so the Buddha looks so many ways, right? It's so much more than just a matter of spiritual thing. There's a kind of broad humanizing thing with the Buddha. You see in the sutras, you see the Buddha washing his own feet. You see the Buddha setting his own kuti in order before he sets out traveling. You see the Buddha not being able to persuade the monks to be, live in harmony together. So the Buddha just has to walk away, dismiss the Buddha in a fairly rude kind of way. There's all of the things, and many of those things are also in the Vinaya. Another example from the Vinaya is where the Buddha is walking around the kutis, walking around the monastery, which he would do quite regularly. Yeah, so this is also a nice thing. He looks at the kutis, looks at the monks, how are they doing, and all these kind of things. And then he sees a monk who's repairing his robe, and he says, "Well done for repairing your robe. Yeah, this is good." And it's very ordinary, very beautiful, yeah, very down to earth. And so things you see there. So it has been for me, it's been very important to humanize the Buddha, because I feel if we put the Buddha on the wrong pedestal, then his teachings lose their power. It's precisely because he's a human being. It is precisely because he understands our situation, our circumstances, that his teachings are so powerful, that his own autophy so important, because he's showing us by saying, this is how I practiced the same way. And this is what makes it so extraordinary. And of course, one of the things about the Vinaya is that it has that life story of the Buddha from when he becomes enlightened. At the beginning of the Sangha, it tells the story between those two events, basically. And that's another kind of very spiritually potent story, although I must say there are some late elements in that story which are, we shouldn't take too literally. Nevertheless, it's a very powerful story. So that is kind of how I look at some of the spiritual issues, I suppose. When it comes to more linguistic issues that you come across, one of the things that you realize fairly early on is that the Vinaya is not as homogeneous and is not taken from one period of time quite in the same way as the suttas are. It is a bit more of a patchwork. Yeah, it has been added to over a long period of time. I think some of the latest part of the Vinaya may be even a few centuries after the Buddha. Certainly the Parivara, but even some of the Khandaka parts or some of the sections in the Sutta Vibhanga will tend to be much later. You find words like the word Abhidhamma meaning here, text as compared to as where it just means about the or something like that. You find reference to writing in the Sutta Vibhanga, and writing is something that is not. I think there's one reference in the Udana reference in the Sutta Vibhanga, but otherwise not really known about. So linguistically, it will be very interesting to use in the Vinaya to the Sutta, because I think you will find some substantial variations in vocabulary. A little bit on that basis would be very interesting. But it recognizes that the Vinaya is a chronologically layered document. It is not something that all came out at the time of the Buddha. And that makes it interesting from the point of view of how it should be practiced and what we should take of these kind of things. Maybe I'll stop there, Venerable. Otherwise, I'll...
So much fun. This is so good.
I wish we had set aside 3 hours.
Did you have 3 hours?
Bhante, I love that you foregrounded that story of the Buddha looking after the monk, and then his lesson is, those who would look after me, you should look after others. Whoever looks after others is as if looking after me. And in terms of translation, most Buddha statues, the Buddha is sitting in meditation or he's standing, and he's got several different mudras. But in a monastery in northeast Thailand, I saw a statue of that scene in the style of Michelangelo's Pieta, La Pieta. So, and it's a beautiful statue. So just as Mother Mary, holding Jesus, so it's the Buddha holding this monk with dysentery, and just, translating this ancient concept, translating it from the medium of the verbal word into the written word into the sculpted stone, translating from India to Italy and back to Thailand. It's just, it's a really beautiful statue. So yeah, thanks for highlighting that.
Yeah, no, great. I'm actually glad that we do that kind of thing, because that again, it brings out the, when we have a Buddha statues, and Buddha statues are often very beautiful, helpful, but they're often very, they don't sort of think it kind of brings out Buddha in a more real and realistic fashion, which I think is great. Yeah.
And I find even just hearing you talk about the kind of resonance of the Renaissance, it always, those kind of translated Western images like really strike deeply, because of my conditioning as well. And I keep fluctuating between asking you questions about modernity, which I know will be very relevant for people, but I can't resist asking you these monk questions because or sort of deeper Pali scholarship. And the two ones I'm really curious about, not so much Pali scholarship, but the big one is in the Vinaya, people may know the Buddha only laid down a rule once a monk or nun had broken a rule or transgressed in some way that required a rule to be laid down. And there's a very interesting interplay where people ask if the Buddha knows all things at all times, if he's omniscient. And he says no, or he says one could not be. But the commentaries understand that as saying that, although a Buddha might not know all things at all times, if at any given moment he directs his mind to something, he could know it. And I am curious what you make of these moments in the suttas where the Buddha allows something to happen, which is sometimes quite tragic. I mean, a whole, community of monks die committing suicide because they contemplate the body too heavily. So how do you make sense of that? Like, is it the Buddha allowing things to happen such that there's context for this, or is it just, the Buddha wasn't knowing everything at every moment and navigating the world as it was? And a bonus question, do you see so many of the transgressions in the suttas are from the group of six or in the Vinaya? And I've wondered if you think that's just a catch-all to make it seem like all the monastics weren't doing bad all the time. So they just say, oh, that was the group of six again and again. So that's just a little extra cherry on top I've wondered about for a good 13 years. Yeah.
I idea of making the Buddha into some kind of omniscient being. I find it, we lose Buddha when you see that. He becomes too different from us. I like to think of the Buddha as I think of any teacher, someone who is a human being, someone who's on basic same level. I do not mean to minimize his wisdom was inside. I mean, that to me is what is amazing, is his wisdom condition. That is what matters. That is what makes the Buddha extraordinary. And I think they detract. But I think, what happens, I think very often in the, in a tradition, you can imagine the ancient Indians, they lost the Buddha, and often traumatic for that tradition. And I think as Buddha, they started to write Buddha biographies. This is why you find it in the Kandakas at the beginning of the Kandakas. That's why you find, the Buddha biography in the Nidana and these kind of things, because people wanted to know who was this amazing teacher. And so I think there is a tendency to exaggerate and to the Buddha on the pedestal because we want to show how important and how magnificent he was. And without running the consequences. Everything in the world has unforeseen consequences. I think the unforeseen consequence here is that it take away some of the humanity of the Buddha. And I think that is really unfortunate. We should reclaim some of the Buddha as a human being. And we should be a little bit skeptical to the commentaries when they talk about miracles and amazing things. That in the context of the times when they wanted to elevate, to feel that we had some, and I think then by reclaiming the Buddha in that way, I think actually we're doing a big service to Buddhism, a big service to the Dhamma. So so I'm not a finger, and I often offend people in countries. These things, maybe we should look at these things, and people sometimes get offended. However, if I am going to be in a nice way, and it is important that we don't shine away from the controversial things. Always shy from controversial things, and nobody learns things. We have to be straightforward about that. So that is the first part. The question is about the group of six. And yes, I think that the group of six, they are like an empty vessel upon the demeanors of the monastic community is kind of placed onto that group of six. I think that is especially obvious in the Seika rules. A rule, I think, done by the group of six, according to and I think what that shows is that they had no idea who actually made transgressions. It had to be somebody, and so they had it kind of placed in there, and the group of six became the perpetrators. And then, of course, we have the group of six bhikkhuni, then based on the group of 6 monks. The whole thing becomes a little bit suspicious when you see it. So, yes. So my answer is yes to the second part of your question.
Just so no one accuses us of being a group of three, I'm going to switch your shoulder there. We got our robes on the right shoulder now. Hope that's okay. I'm curious. Something. Right. Well, talking about translation, it's hard now. We can't really avoid talking about AI, and you do most of your translation is available through Sutta Central, which has and Discourse at Sutta Central has a very clear AI policy. And I'm curious what your take on translating with using AI. Do you feel it's immoral? Do you just feel it's lacking of, lacking of a soul doesn't make sense because, of course, anatta, but the humanity of actually having a human translator. Curious if you could just lay that out for people, because honestly, I mean, it's good for what it is, and it's just going to get better in terms of and people not even be able to tell which is AI versus a human translator. And so much of that is just based on your data, Bhikkhu Bodhi's translations, Bhante Sujato's, all of these giants of translations. That's where AI is getting their information from. But yeah, if you could just fill that out for people.
Yeah. I think there may be a place for AI in certain very limited respects. But I think we have to be very careful. The problem is that you never really know the accuracy of AI. There's so many reports of inaccuracies and problems. I don't know, there was a report by Google, the Google search engine these days, it has the AI summary or whatever, and it's only about 90% correct. Yeah. So in other words, 1 out of 10 information is wrong. That's a lot, right? If you get 1 out of that means that 1 factors of the Noble Eightfold Path is likely to be wrong. That's problematic. Yeah. So you have to be. So I think we have to be really, really careful when we use. Sometimes AI can be helpful if we use it maybe as a corrective. We can make mistakes. If you use AI to kind of to help you use as a corrective, then it can be helpful. But using AI first, I think, is often very, very dangerous, because then you're led astray by it. The more is that AI, I think, from a Buddhist point of view, is obviously not conscious. The idea that AI is conscious, I think, is ridiculous from a Buddhist point of view. It doesn't make any sense. And because it isn't conscious, it doesn't experience the world. It has no idea what's going on. It's a purely statistical machine that churns out words and churns out text based on statistics, and very clever programming, no doubt. But nevertheless, it doesn't really have no idea what it's doing. It's just leaning on all the creative work done by people in the past, taking it in a different kind of way. But it's not really creative in the way that human beings are. We are creative because we experience the world. We feel the going on. And that obviously gives a very different creativity, a very different kind of realization of what life. So I would, I tend to agree with Bhante Sujato's. Ask him about this, because he's going to have some powerful views on in this area. However, I think on the other side, I think that when you have texts that haven't been translated before, that may be very obscure, there may be no translator at hand, maybe AI can be used to help with that kind of translation, get an initial understanding for what is going on there. So I'm not as wide as Bhante Sujato, although I appreciate some of his kind of his arguments nonetheless. I'm nowhere near being. I don't know all that much about AI, but that's kind of roughly where I stand. Yeah.
Where your choices sort of settle. But Bhante, I want to, take a moment to focus in on this translating the ancient teachings into modern context. And one thing you bring up in talks, and you talk about the modern moment with quite a lot of nuance and care. It's appreciated. But I'm curious what you would sort of say to, you've spoken about, say, the rise of nationalism worldwide and how that relates to the creation of self, and how we as Buddhists have a particular way of holding that makes sense of it meaningfully. But more than that, and also a recent talk at Sati Center, you speak about how, there's real power in understanding that our sense of well-being is not predicated on external circumstance, and really, like, spiritual well-being can be something we cultivate regardless. So I'm curious, do you have any words for those watching the interview who are watching with alarm various movements in the world, wars, AI disruption, whatever it might be, and feel anger, fear, concern? I know it's very powerful to look to how the Buddha navigated these moments with equipoise and care, but what thoughts would you give for translating that same equanimity to the modern moment?
Okay, yeah, no, I think that's an incredibly important point, and I think that one of the things that we are obliged to do as Buddhists, especially as Buddhist monastics, is to make the Dhamma relevant, to the modern world, and obviously right now. So I applaud you for bringing these things up, and I think that there's a large number of questions. One of the answer is that what is often happening in the world is not necessarily as bad as we think. We remember that very much of the commentary and the way we look at things is influenced by the Christian. Is even though many people these days are no longer Christian, they may be Gnostics or whatever, still that world dominant in our culture, and it forms the way we tend to look at things. Like the war in, you see the enormous amount of lives that have been crying. We're talking about hundreds of millions of people, lives have been lost. Many of them are just ordinary people going about their ordinary lives. Many of them. Then what is the Buddhist kind of way of thinking about that? And I think the Buddha, to my mind, that death is not necessarily as bad as we think it is. In a Christian outlook, of course, the idea of dying is terrible, because this is the gift of God, and if God has, we shouldn't kind of, make sure we look after that gift properly, or whatever the right terminology is. But in Buddhism, this cycle of dying and being born anyway, and so you are going to die, is far more important than whether you die or not, is how you live. There's people who have died, who have been good, lived good lives, and there's no bad karma involved in dying, apart from the person who kills you, of course. And so often I think the victims of this world actually, gone to heavenly, maybe they're more happy being dead than they were being alive. I don't know. It's much more complex than just dying. It's bad karma that is bad. It's living a bad life. That is, of course, there's another aspect to that, and that is all the family behind and who grieve. That is obvious problem. But for the people themselves, it is not as terrible as we sometimes think. Just point that I wouldn't point is that when we are in difficulties, when the world is growing wrong, then there is an opportunity to grow in wisdom, to understand things in a new way. The dangers of everything well, which it has done in the Western world since I've gone really, really well. Economies have been growing, and everyone. But the problem is you tend to become complacent. And because you become complacent, you allow nationalist movements. You're not really afraid of things that you probably should be afraid of. You see a lot of anger, hatred against minorities and all kind of things. It's terribly, very anti-Buddhist. And this is because we become complacent. We allow us to kind of start playing with us, like driving us in stupid kind of way. And so if we take a moment of difficulties, it is precisely because it is difficult that it also is pregnant with such wisdom and so much understanding. This is such a key insight into the Dhamma. Yeah, when it says in the suttas, if you suffer, there are two outcomes of suffering: is that you become deluded and stupid. Another one is to search for a way out. The way out is the path to wisdom, to kind of doing things in a different way. And so, what we should learn from all the problems of the world is that, number one, there's no refuge in the world. The world is inherently unreliable. You have no idea what the world is going to do next. It is not that the world is always going, not at all. It is the uncertainty which is the big problem in the world. One of the reasons we get angry is because about impermanence. We forgot about that and we didn't realize that actually the world has this underlying problem which is always going to be. And once you understand that refuge should not be found in the world, then of course there is on the spiritual path. Refuge that you find on the spiritual path is precisely the refuge the Buddha talks about in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the greater discourse in the Buddha's passing away, where he's who is grieving the fact that the Buddha is very sick and about to pass away. He says to Ananda, be a refuge unto yourself. Let the Dhamma be your refuge. How do you? Well, it is by practicing the four satipatthanas. The four satipatthanas is basically about finding peace, joy, happiness. Very important part of this. All of this is within, rather outside. And if it is found within, then precisely because that is something of a degree of ability to control it, make refuge for yourself. And this is the beautiful thing. So if we use of the world in the right way, it turns us away from the world. It turns us onto the spiritual path. And this is this is about wisdom difficulties. So used in the right way, this is a moment of great opportunity, but we have to use the loss of a period of time.
Bhante, speaking of the grief of separation, I think we're going to have to getting close to the end of the interview. But just wanted to highlight for people. I mean, you're bringing up how having a different scope, a broader scope of one's a death plays in that. You speak and translate this concept, this truth of rebirth, very lucidly. For moderners to hear, I would refer people to your essay, Rebirth, 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 on Sutta Central. And also you've got a debate actually with Stephen Batchelor from 2014 that's on YouTube, which I've seen several times, and it's still great. You hold the conservative, I'd say, right view line, to be so bold, very well. And you do bring up points which I think modern skeptical ears might be able to hold. You're not just a blind traditionalist. So would point people in those directions, and we'll try to put those links into the description. Yeah.
Great.
One final thing before we do part ways, Tanajan, do you have any just advice for, say 2 young monks starting a monastery in Seattle? Any words of wisdom for us? That's pretty good. I'll take it. Don't be a group of 6. We can do that. Tanajan, we're so honored and delighted to have you. Come visit us soon, and just appreciate your presence and teachings a great deal. For those who want, we'll be on jumping over to. Oh, sorry, the lag's terrible. I'm sorry, Tanajan. You first.
It's been wonderful to meet you. I've always been very impressed by what you're doing over there, and so keep up the good work and carry on. And as I said, just have time and enjoy yourself.
Well, for those who are interested in having a good time over on Zoom, we pasted the link into the chat. Please feel free to join us over there. If you can't find it there, you can find a link to the event listing in the YouTube description, and the link is there. We'll see you over there soon. Bante, Grab Namasekan Kapong.
Okay, bye. Bye-bye. Yeah.